everyone. We are going to get started here in just a minute or two. We really appreciate folks tuning in, especially with the holidays ongoing and pending. But we really ended the year with a bang in terms of cannabis reform. So we're gonna really dive into the kind of nuances of this landmark federal action. We have some remarkable speakers to touch on that, and I think I'm going to give it a minute or two, and we'll let folks settle in, and then we'll get jump right into it. We were really humbled and happy to have over 1,000 registrants come in for this. So we will not only be providing a bunch of wonderful, lively content, we also will share the recording afterwards and put it on YouTube, and you can share it with your friends, all those fun things. So we'll get going here in just about a minute. We do have some remarkable speakers. And with that, what time do we have? Looks like folks are still coming on in, so we'll give it just another 30 seconds. And I'm Brian Vicente, by the way. I'm a founder of the law firm, and we're going to hear from a number of colleagues as well as some outside experts from the firm today as well. So it's truly going to be fun. But I'll kind of kick things off. Obviously, it's been a hell of a year for cannabis and hemp, and ended really with a bang. We saw really the biggest federal shift in 50 plus years come down last week. So with President Trump's sort of announcement, executive order around cannabis and rescheduling, we're going to talk all through that. Of course, it's not just rescheduling, but we also have a pilot program. Seems to be focused on CBD. We'll talk through that. We'll also talk about the interactions with hemp, and we got a fair amount of guidance there as well. So it's truly going to be a big year. I would say I feel like we're particularly in tune to be speaking about this change. Our firm started working with the Biden administration in 2022. We then started working with the Trump administration, who's kind of been at the table throughout, providing guidance as the scheduling process has moved forward. We actually represented a petitioner at the DEA hearing that was scheduled to move forward to look at moving cannabis down the scheduling system. And we also helped coordinate thousands of comments from the public. There are 40,000 some comments that came in that said, basically almost entirely move cannabis to Schedule 3 or just reschedule altogether. So we helped with that. We also contributed to the sort of coalition effort informing the FDA's recommendation to move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, with a particular focus on the kind of international treaty piece. So we've really been at the table for quite a while. I think everyone's aware of this, but we did have 1,000 registrants, so I want to make sure we're kind of hitting everyone's level at the beginning. But there's a scheduling system in the country. Schedule 1 are the sort of most dangerous drugs and have no medical value and are addictive. Cannabis has been sitting there next to heroin since 1970, when the Nixon administration and Congress sort of put that there. As you go down the scheduling system, there's a remarkable difference between Schedule 1 and Schedule 3. Schedule 3 includes drugs like anabolic steroids, codeine, and that is now where cannabis is headed, right? The president sort of put into effect this executive order, and we'll talk through that timeline. But truly remarkable progress. And I will say, it was quite touching to watch that White House ceremony. We've represented hundreds of medical cannabis patients over the years, people dying of AIDS, cancer, parents losing their parenting time, being kicked out of housing, patients denied transplants because of being medical patients. So to have the federal government, who really had considered those people criminals since the 70s, to acknowledge marijuana as medicine is truly a landmark step forward. For many of us, it's not the end game. We would like to see a descheduling or a legalization, and I think we're on the path to that. I think will get us closer to state reform, federal reform. It'll be an accelerant, but we're not quite there. But we do have absolute landmark reform to discuss today. So I'm going to turn things over in a second to our speakers. I will say that Colorado Governor, our good friend Jared Polis, was scheduled to speak last night. He got in touch and has sort of an emergency travel issue come up. So he will not be speaking today, unfortunately. But we are going to dive right in to the timeline, the nuances of how it interacts with hemp, the many, many business implications regarding 280E and the pilot program for CBD, et cetera. So with that, I'll turn things over to my partner, Sean Hauser, who will take us through the medical side of this. Sean?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about the medical piece and sort of this new era and power of unlocking the doctors and unlocking the medicine. We're really moving from an era of no accepted medical use, like Brian said, which just flies in the face of science and medicine, and by design was set for folks to not have access to evidence-based medicine. Schedule 3 formally ends the no accepted medical use era, and it also establishes a new standard for what is medical use, which historically the FDA has interpreted in a narrow manner to just focus on FDA approved drugs. What the HHS and DOJ did in this process was replace their previously very restrictive test to determine, what is medical use and treatment in the United States to include state data, even in state programs using non-FDA approved drugs. So this rescheduling recognizes the 30,000 plus practitioners and 6+ million patients who have used medical cannabis in treatment and state authorized programs, and then shows that there's credible determined, the HHS determined there's credible evidence for certain conditions like pain and anorexia, nausea and vomiting. And that really sets the stage for, what we can do with coordinated state and federal research. I'll talk about the pilot programs a little bit later in the program here. But that new two-part test is really significant to what we can do now and what's possible in the future. And, I would also note that I think there's a lot of power in the destigmatization of the medical institutions and, sort of unlocking the doctors and the medicine. The rescheduling and acknowledgement of medical use really signals to hospitals, universities, medical schools that cannabis is a, legitimate medicine with safety and efficacy, and it paves the way for the endocannabinoid system to be integrated into medical curriculum, which it's not right now. And I just believe that once we empower doctors with education and understanding the science of medicine, a lot is possible. Importantly, Schedule 3 does not allow cannabis to be sold at your neighborhood pharmacy. It doesn't allow the current dispensary system to sell cannabis products through interstate commerce. Both of those avenues are limited to FDA approved drugs, which right now are limited to Epidiolex and 3 other synthetic cannabis-based drugs for specific conditions. Cannabis sold in state legal marijuana dispensaries will remain in violation of federal law, the DEA, and the FDA. But something the president did here was really set the table for, hemp, which we'll talk about a bit later, and cannabis to align around a true pathway for medical cannabis versus adult use cannabis. So what's possible going forward with respect to interstate commerce and sort of expanded medical programs, I think is much different than it was a few weeks ago with Schedule 3. It also means, and we'll talk about this in more detail, the end of 280E, which is the most immediate and tangible impact for dispensaries, and ends the crushing tax burden that's stifled their growth and profitability and ability to invest in research and things like these state federal partnerships. But I think the reduction of stigma, signaling the federal recognition of medical value, and encouraging more physicians and healthcare systems to engage with cannabis therapies and giving them the education and federal and state engagement to do that really can't be understated. And there's a lot of questions and confusion around research, which is critically important. And as I said, it was the data that came out of these state programs that helped get us to Schedule 3. So research is obviously critical in forming evidence-based care, but also good regulatory programs at state and federal levels. In Schedule 3, researchers will still need DEA registered sources. Schedule 3 does lower the barrier to entry and could expand the pool of suppliers, but we will also need to focus on reforming um, additional blocks that still exist for cannabis specifically, including those in the Medical Marijuana and CBD Expansion Act. Really marijuana's Schedule One status and the just outrageous policies that DEA implemented stemming from their Schedule One status made it nearly impossible by design to conduct the standard of research that proves the medical efficacy and safety of cannabis. And they've for years denied petitions and ignored evidence and then cited that lack of evidence to block rescheduling. And now we're here with the opportunity to really expand resources, research, and have the resources needed to to fix the additional obstacles. So I really do think this unlocks, the potential for research in a meaningful way. And again, it signals to universities and hospitals and medical institutions that cannabis research can be conducted within federal law. They're not going to be worried that it's going to jeopardize funding, carry professional stigma. And I just think that's going to stem broader participation from the medical industry. And then, coupled with what's possible with these state pilot programs, we can really get the data necessary to guide treatment and ensure, evidence-based reforms. And, the FDA has already begun, you know, looking at or moving more quickly than they used to. As many know, Dr. Sisley's trial with real-world cannabis, botanical cannabis for veterans has been ongoing upon obstacle for years and years. They recently cleared that phase 2 trial funded by state grants. And I think all of that signals a willingness to study the actual botanical products patients are using rather than just isolated cannabinoids. And what we can do, with research and driving those pathways and the pilot programs is significant. So, I really think the Schedule 3, it validates state medical markets. It's moving federal policy from prohibition to, deference and cooperation with state medical experience, and, giving us a real opportunity to use state regulated medical use as data alongside critical trials. And we're set up to pursue both. So I will talk a little bit more about the pilot programs later in the program here. But the EO directs agencies to develop research models using real world evidence. There's a lot of opportunity, and there's opportunity to engage at state and federal levels and to create partnerships. So we're really positioned, well for future reforms. And obviously, all of this will depend on the implementation and execution of the Schedule 3 reclassification. So I'll turn it over to my partner, Tim, to walk through that.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. I'm going to walk through give a brief overview of the rulemaking process and the ways in which rescheduling may play out. While the president has broad authority to direct the priorities of the executive branch, he does not have the statutory authority to unilaterally reschedule a controlled substance by fiat. The Controlled Substances Act delegates statutory authority to the Attorney General, which in turn delegated its authority to the DEA, and to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, requiring a specific administrative rulemaking process that includes scientific evaluation and public notice and comment. The executive order is likely lawful because it does not attempt to unilaterally reschedule marijuana by presidential fiat. Instead, it directs the executive branch agencies, DOJ and DEA, to prioritize expedite their statutory duties under the Controlled Substances Act. Specifically, the president's executive order, which was dated December 18, 2025, directs the Attorney General to, quote, take all necessary steps to complete the rulemaking process related to rescheduling marijuana to Reschedule 3 in accordance with federal law, including 21 U.S.C. 811. By citing 21 U.S.C. 811, the executive order affirms that the process must still follow the statutory requirements of the CSA, which involves binding scientific and medical recommendations from HHS and adherence to administrative procedures. Therefore, the executive order is a lawful directive to agencies to prioritize and expedite their statutory duties rather than an attempt to bypass Congress or the Controlled Substances Act. The Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel has issued an opinion confirming that the two-part test used by HHS to recommend rescheduling, which was widespread medical use in states plus credible scientific support, is a valid interpretation of the Controlled Substances Act and legally sufficient to establish, quote, currently accepted medical use. This legal backing strengthens the EO's enforceability against challenges, arguing that it bypasses the traditional five-part test utilized by the DEA. The EO also directs the assistant to the president to work with Congress to update the statutory definition of hemp-derived products. This is a lawful exercise of the president's power to recommend legislation and direct agency policy, but it acknowledges that the definition of hemp is a matter of statutory law, specifically the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946 and the 2018 Farm Bill, that ultimately requires congressional action to amend. Section 2B of the EO directs the administration to develop a framework that allows Americans access to, quote, appropriate full spectrum CBD products. This creates a potential lifeline for Texas hemp businesses focusing on non intoxicating wellness products, which might otherwise have been caught in the broad total THC ban intended for intoxicating products. The rulemaking process could play out in one of two ways. As the fastest approach, the DEA administrator may reschedule marijuana to Schedule 3 without taking the time for public comment because the CSA permits expedited rescheduling when necessary to fulfill U.S. treaty obligations. Specifically, if a treaty to which the U.S. is party requires parties to control marijuana, 21 U.S.C. 811 D1 requires the issuance of an order controlling marijuana under the schedule deemed most appropriate to carry out the treaty obligations. This process does not require notice and comment rulemaking procedures. In other words, if a drug is controlled by international treaty, the DEA is not required to engage in standard rulemaking procedures. There is direct precedent for utilizing this approach. Under the previous Trump administration, the PDLX, a formulation of cannabis extract, was rescheduled to comply with U.S. obligations under the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The alternative and likely slower approach involves the agencies electing to proceed through formal notice and comment rulemaking. Under this path, a draft proposed rule would likely be submitted to the White House Office of Management and Budget for review to the extent the action qualifies as a significant regulatory action. Following any required OMB clearance, the proposed rule would be published in the Federal Register for public comment. Comment periods typically range from 30 to 60 days, though longer periods are possible at the agency's discretion. If such a process occurs, we recommend engaging us to support the development and submission of comments to advance key objectives. But whichever path is taken, expect opponents to commence litigation challenging rescheduling on procedural and other grounds. The likelihood of success of such litigation depends on several factors, including which process is employed to accomplish rescheduling, whether the process is carried out by the AG or the DEA administrator, and other such factors. While fully ending prohibition requires federal legalization of cannabis through descheduling and regulatory frameworks, this is a critical incremental step towards this goal. We strongly encourage advocacy throughout the rulemaking process and the critical reforms that will be pursued following rescheduling, including but not limited to banking, capital markets, states' rights, resolving the hemp cannabis conflict, and federal regulatory frameworks. Now I'll turn things over to my partner, Charlie Alavsetti, to discuss 280E and the tax implications of rescheduling.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the business and financial implications of Trump's executive order here. So I guess I'll start with a little bit with what Sean touched on earlier, but to me, this EO is an inflection point in the industry. Those of us that have been in this industry a while, you've seen a number of permutations of this industry, right? There was, the medical start, and then you saw, the green rush. We've been in a bit of a cannabis either recession or depression, depending on how you look at it. But I look at that as, now we're in, I don't know, third inning. It's hard to say, right, without the benefit of hindsight, exactly where we are. But I certainly think that we've entered a new era of cannabis. I view this as a renaissance of the cannabis industry. I think we're back, baby. This is going to be a huge game changer for the industry. And so that I'll put that as my first point, one, which is, as the kids say, this is a vibe shift. And this is a big one for us. So I think everyone in this industry, everyone on this, webinar, what have you, is involved in the cannabis industry, is invested in the cannabis industry. So I think it's sort of it's contingent on all of us to take advantage of this, right? In terms of pushing for meaningful reforms, both at the federal level that we still need, at the state level to improve these markets, and then in sort of just in terms of messaging, right? So anyway, that's I think the first and most important takeaway is I think this will have profound effects on the industry just by nature of the fact that we've seen positive federal change in the right direction. Okay, so point number two, right? In terms of dollars and cents, right? By far and away, the most important impact of the EO will be its impact on 280E, right? And I think I saw a question here earlier, right? So 280E has not gone away yet. And the actual disappearance of 280E is going to be contingent on what Tim just talked about, right? So, the president can't reschedule himself, but, he has ordered the attorney general to proceed with rescheduling, right? So whenever rescheduling is actually final, right? So not during a comment period, but whenever there's a final rule, at that point, 280 will cease to exist because 280E, the language of 280 talks about people that are scheduling or trafficking a drug within the meaning of Section 1 or Section 2 of the Controlled Substances Act. So the second you're in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act, there is no longer any argument that this benefit, sorry, that it's applicable to the cannabis industry. All right. So now, so that's massive. Now, of course, like the what's tricky here, right, and that we're still working on is this raises a number of additional questions, right, that I don't have the answer to just now, and that I think we'll probably publish further thoughts on, and we may do a webinar dedicated to this. But it raises a number of questions, right? When 280E goes away, are we talking about, does the entire year, let's say it goes away in 2026, are you subject to 280E for 0% of 2026? Is it a partial year where part of the year, tax year is subject to 280E, part of the year is not subject to 280E? What happens to past 280E tax liabilities, which I do not think will necessarily go away, but we don't know this for sure, right? The IRS is going to have to issue some guidance here. And it's also, this is taking place in the context of a business environment where many cannabis companies are not filing their taxes as if 280 applies. So, this started as a trend, and essentially people have been filing their taxes and affirmatively disclosing the position they don't believe 280 applies to their business. There are a number of legal arguments to support this. One of which I should note is this Canna Provisions case that was not granted cert at the Supreme Court. So that case, that argument, which is basically has to do with interstate versus intrastate commerce, can't be relied on anymore. But there still are, I think, very strong legal arguments applying to 280E. So, and again, this applies to both adult use and medical cannabis, right? So it's just Schedule 1, Schedule 2. That's all 280E is. So, like, obviously this has a tremendous impact on the cash flow of the businesses, because if you're a cannabis operator right now, you might be paying between 70 and 90% tax rate. And with the disappearance of 280E, you go back to the normal world, right? So, between 20 and 30% tax rate, like a typical business. Because now you can start taking advantage of the ordinary deductions. Of course, that makes your tax planning a lot more complex. So that's the biggest point. The 280 goes away once it's actually been rescheduled. Third point I'll make for the group here, right, which is, and I think I've already seen this a little bit in the chat here, but I would ignore the noise, right? Unfortunately, I spent a little bit too much time on LinkedIn, which is a font of misinformation these days, because there's essentially there's no IQ test required to take very strong positions on business or political points of view. And you see people saying that, hey, this is going to hand the industry to big pharma. I don't see how that happens. I'm open to being convinced otherwise, but I don't see how big pharma decides to develop drugs. I mean, there are already drugs. There's Marinol, right, which is for chemotherapy. There's Epidiolex, which is for epilepsy, juvenile epilepsy. And there are two formulations of synthetic THC. There's Marinol, there's another one. Has this destroyed the ability of cannabis operators to run their businesses? Big pharma can already legally sell cannabis, right? Um, so I just don't see how big pharma takes over because the U.S. medical system is not designed to sell botanical products, right? Flower, vape pens. These don't fit into the medical system. So if you want to legally sell a Schedule 3 drug, it can be botanically derived, but it has to be a very specific molecule, right? And it has to go through the FDA approval process. Yes, you could compound drugs, which that's a potential avenue here. But I mean, is that going to destroy the market for licensed cannabis businesses? I just don't buy it. And I also think you need to think about these big pharmaceutical companies. What does a pharmaceutical company like to sell, right? They like to sell a product that essentially is necessary, right? It's life-saving or it can't be really replaced easily, and it's patented, right? No one can sell it besides them, right? And that produces one of the most profitable industries known to humanity, which is pharma. But if you're selling cannabis, it's not really unique. It's not really patentable. Um, and you also have to contend with this vast market. And even if you were to shut down all the state legal industries, it would only push it into the illicit market, and you would be competing with a vast illicit market because unless you're going to, allocate hundreds of billions of dollars, you're not going to eliminate this. So I'm not convinced that's the case. And I would also be very careful about taking people's views on the stock market in terms of why stocks are going up or stocks going down. I myself, I think, we're a little bit guilty of this and thinking it's just as simplistic as, retail investors are dominating the public markets and they're sort of irrational. It's very complicated. There's short sellers, there are big hedge funds involved here. I'm not going to pontificate on this because I am not an expert on the public markets, but I would just be careful about sort of intuiting too much from, the stocks go up, it's great. The stocks go down, it's terrible news. There's more at play here in terms of short sellers. Um, so five, I'm going to talk about this issue, which let's see, I got 4 more minutes here. There's a lot of ground to cover here. So really quick, five, I think we're going to distinguish moving it to Schedule 3 does not make it completely legal, right? It's still illegal to sell a Schedule 3 substance unless it's through the medical pathway. So the vast majority of the business in this country is still going to be legal. Now, there are going to be opportunities for stuff that's going to be fully federally legal, right? So let's break it down, right? You've got if they go back to Congress and work to fix the definition of hemp, whatever that definition of hemp is, will create a pathway to operate a federally legal business, right? There's this medical cannabis pilot program, which is also going to be, it's going to piggyback off the hemp definition. That will also be federally legal. FDA approved cannabinoid drugs. I mean, there's a very limited, right? Marinol, Epidiolex, that's federally legal. Certain compounded drugs, which you talked about, like maybe you could compound these molecules that have been approved by the FDA. But other than that, the vast majority of licensed cannabis activity in this country is going to remain federally illegal, which matters because this it means you're still cut off from certain things like bankruptcy courts. You're probably still cut off from public markets, um, payment processing. There's still going to be trademark issues. So a lot of these problems, the mosquitoes of the cannabis life are going to remain. They're not going away completely because cannabis will continue to operate in a gray zone. But I think the fact that we're operating in a gray zone is good for the cannabis industry because if you had full federal legalization today, now all of a sudden you're competing with every company in America. The big Fortune 500 companies are not going to want to sell a product that remains federally legal. Maybe they'll do a hemp product, but in terms of selling, high potency flower, vapes, edibles, the kind of stuff that people go buy at dispensaries, Budweiser isn't going to do that as long as it's federally illegal. Um, Point six, um, and I guess I can conflate that a bit with point seven, which is the friction will still exist, right? I think some of the friction goes away as because a lot of these decisions, right? If you look at banks that have entered the industry, right? Of course, it's not your big banks. It's not your JP Morgan that's offering depository services. It's your credit unions that are looking for more business. But I think the friction will reduce. It'll still remain though, because I mean, I think you'll see more banks make the risk decision to enter the space because they'll see this as a positive sign and it's less likely the federal government cracks down. Especially because it's like, look, if the Trump administration doesn't crack down, right? Do you think the Democrats are going to crack down? I mean, at this point, who is going to crack down? I mean, God forbid Tucker Carlson becomes president. That's a different issue. But I mean, right now, there's no one with political power, right, who's trying to push the crackdown. So it's going to get people more comfortable. I don't think you're going to get there on payment processing yet, but I think you'll get more access to private capital markets, and I think the public capital markets will they're not going to change the rules overnight, but they might bend a little bit. I think you're also going to see a tremendous amount of deal making. This is point six. A lot of these companies with massive historic tax liabilities, they got to decide, they got to do something, right? They've got valuable assets, but they've got these massive historical tax liabilities. What do you do? I mean, you may see deals where people are trying to jettison these past tax liabilities and move on with a fresh start. Because if you start a company, after rescheduling, you're not going to have this history of 280E tax liabilities that some of these big companies have right now. I think you're also going to see structural cleanup. People set up these structures to deal with 280E that don't really make sense anymore. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe you want to reevaluate being a pass-through entity from a tax perspective as opposed to a corporation because you're not trying to block that 280 liability from your members, right? I'm talking fast here. Hemp cannabis convergences. I think you're going to see increased cross-sector strategies. I think people are going to be on both sides of the fence, depending on how it looks. I think you're going to see increased M&A because again, fresh, renaissance here, five shift. There's now a demand opportunity. Of course, a lot of these businesses that aren't doing particularly well, it's sort of come too late for them. So there's still opportunities out there. I mean, there's there's deals out there to be made. I also still think ESOPs, it mostly dealt with 280E, but it still has an advantage. If you're not paying any federal state taxes, it's still an opportunity. It's an alternative to a private equity backed exit. I don't think you see private equity jump into the space anytime soon with Schedule 3, because again, it's still federally legal. Maybe they touch the hemp stuff, but I think of that. So the last thing I'll say, I'm like a minute over time here, but in terms of what operators should be doing right now, one, you should be reevaluating your tax planning and looking at your prior year tax positions. I think rescheduling strengthens the argument that 280E no longer applies. So let's think about maybe you're going to go back and amend past taxes, but certainly you want to think about your future tax planning. So talk to your tax accountant, talk to your accountants about that. I think you want to relook at your financials, right? Like, what do your financials look like now that you're not subject to 280E? That's going to look a lot better than it used to look. Be sure you're communicating that with your investors. Reevaluate your structure. Does your structure still make sense in a post 280E landscape? Definitely communicate with your investors. Make sure they're aware of this. This is great news. Share it. And then, five, like, monitor what's going forward. There's going to be a tremendous amount of important information coming out in the next year. Certainly, we'll be tracking it, and I'll pass the baton. Thank you.
Great, Charlie. Thank you for that. My name is Chris Roberts. I'm the executive editor of Marijuana Business Daily, and I know I'm talking in a room full of lawyers here, so hopefully I'm not going to give too much of a legal analysis, but from the business side of things, and also not to repeat too much of what Charlie said. The impact on businesses, the practical impact on businesses right now seems to be relatively limited. And that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, the main reason, of course, is that nothing has actually happened yet, right? Like cannabis is still Schedule 1, and exactly when it's going to be Schedule 3 remains to be seen. There's an administrative law process that has yet to play out all the way, and it could be delayed significantly because of litigation. And on top of that, if you run right now a state compliant cannabis business, you are regulated by state law, and state law hasn't changed. It's the federal law which will eventually have to change in order for you to have interstate commerce, which you do not currently have. It's federal law that will eventually have to change for you to actually then pay, hopefully not yet, extra federal taxes in the form of a federal excise or other sales tax in order to administer federal regulation. So you're right now running, if you are again running a compliant state business, you adhere to state law. There's some practical reasons, there's some practical things that would have to change at the state level in any rescheduling or even legalization scenario for you to be able to sell cannabis legally across state lines. Because as anyone who's tried to comply with metric knows, your product has to be produced in state and sold in state. And a lot of the same problems, unfortunately, that face state compliant cannabis businesses also remain. Price compression is still there. High state tax burdens are still there, or in the case of Michigan, about to get much worse on January 1st. None of that's going to change. But like Charlie said, there is a pretty significant vibe shift here. Because of the eventual elimination of 280E, valuations should go up. And when valuations go up, in theory, if you're running a compliant business, you should be able to access cheaper capital and more of it. We're also hearing that it's possible that the once rescheduling is finalized, that this is going to end the process of every failed or failing business going to receivership. It's possible that a bankruptcy judge could decide to take a cannabis business. It's my understanding, and again, I am speaking in a room full of lawyers. I'm sure I'm going to be corrected if this is not the case. It's my understanding that a bankruptcy judge has a significant amount of leeway whether or not they're going to hear your case. And like Charlie was saying as well, the idea that this is somehow going to immediately lead to a big pharmaceutical company taking over regulated retail sales, I feel like is just not realistic. There's the question of the illicit market. There's also the question of most big pharmaceutical companies like to sell a patented formula that they spend years developing, and botanical cannabis does not fit into that. We are already seeing some impacts on deal flow, potentially. Curaleaf Holdings, for example, was planning to enter the Virginia adult use marijuana market with the acquisition of the cannabis company. And on Friday, they said that they were backing out, not because the deal went wrong, but because it got too expensive. All of a sudden, the valuation of cannabis company, whose struggles are pretty well known, became too much for Curaleaf Holdings to want to acquire. The other thing, of course, that is affecting existing businesses, again, is on the state level. In order for new markets to open up, states have to choose right now to legalize cannabis. And as has been said many times, most of the states, almost all the states that can do so via ballot initiative have already done so. Florida is currently paused. Or rather, it failed in 2024. Trulieve is trying again. It's in this limbo in no small part because of the high burden to pass a constitutional amendment in Florida. You need 60%, and that's not going to change. And anyone who's ever run a campaign will tell you that that is a very difficult threshold to hit. Pennsylvania, another big state for expansion that many businesses are eyeing, doesn't have that luxury, can only do so through the legislature. And as we're seeing already in the Republican caucus, as well as in places like Fox News, where Laura Ingraham spent a lot of time trying to tie the grisly murder of Rob Reiner and his wife to cannabis use, there are a lot of people in a strong position of power who want to keep things the way they are. So just to sum up, because my 5 minutes are up, like Charlie was saying, it's a vibe shift. A lot of things are still the same on a practical level, but they should get better very soon in appreciable ways, such as being able to raise capital. And this should encourage Congress to pass more rules. This should encourage Congress to pass things like safe banking. And it should also encourage state lawmakers and state authorities to become more ambitious with things like social equity programs, should they so choose. That's about all I have time for. I want to pass things off to Adam, who's going to discuss the impact on criminal justice.
And hey, I'm gonna just steal a little Adam's time here. I guess my view is I still don't think a true cannabis business will have access to federal bankruptcy court with limited exceptions. Well, there's one case in California, but that was a company that essentially had wound down its operations and they were just holding publicly traded stock at that point. The issue is that to run a federal bankruptcy process, a Chapter 11, the U.S. trustee has to run the business. And the U.S. trustee has said, we're not going to run a federally illegal business. So until it's federally legal, you're not going to get Chapter 11 in cannabis. But, hemp, this pilot program we're waiting the details on, compounding businesses, FDA approved cannabinoids, those will still be able to access, federal bankruptcy court. Oh, you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I don't know how I got centered here, but hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Charlie, it's fine that you took away a minute. You took away a couple of my minutes because there isn't much to say here, but we wanted to be on just to clarify that the criminal kind of landscape here really is a vibe shift from a substantive standpoint. As we're all aware, marijuana this is co-jurisdictional criminally. It can either be charged criminally at the state level or the federal level. And at the state level, if you're in a regulated marijuana environment where it's been legalized at the state level, your risks at the state level are low unless you're operating outside of your regulatory scheme. And likewise at the federal level, despite the fact that first off, we don't have it, we are not Schedule 3 yet. And when that does occur, substantively, in terms of the Controlled Substances Act, we're not going to, there's not a real major shift in terms of criminal exposure. And the reason for that is that in the Controlled Substances Act, marijuana is specifically enumerated. So the rescheduling is really going to have minimal impact, or marginal impact, I should say, in terms of the criminal penalties and that exposure. With one example that I could highlight is like, for example, um, people probably don't even know this, but it's a felony to advertise a Schedule 1 substance. So if you're putting a billboard up in any state, that is a felony that can be charged in addition to drug trafficking. That would go away, right? Because that's only applies to Schedule 1. But for the most part, people really need to view the construct as exactly the same as it is now, with a vibe shift, because it all really comes down to federal law enforcement priorities. And just as an overall picture, we're seeing the federal involvement is kind of sticking to the old Cole memorandum, which is if you're operating outside your state regulated environment. We've seen enforcement there. We've seen enforcement around, criminal cartels or just operating completely in the illicit market outside of the state regulated um, uh, scheme. We've also seen an uptick both federally and state on the synthetic hemp, which remains, I would say, probably the most high risk from a criminal prosecution. But big picture, under the Controlled Substances Act, although it is going to a Schedule 3, the criminal landscape is staying the same. I would think of the risk as the same, although we will, obviously monitor each U.S. Attorney's Office that's mandated with prosecuting marijuana crimes to see if there's any shift there, but very unlikely. But the criminal sanction side, the risk is going to remain the same. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sean to talk about the pilot programs under the executive order.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, to follow on the direct and impacts on medical direct and indirect impacts on medical cannabis, and really to emphasize just there's two major things that just happened, really three with the hemp directive, but the rescheduling, the initiation of this state coordinated research and trial programs, and then third the directive on hemp. Three major impacts of the executive order. And with respect to the pilot program, the executive order directed Medicare, the CMS, to launch its first pilot testing CBD treatment for seniors. And the goal is to generate, federal data on safety, dosing, and long-term outcomes. And the Howard Kessler pilot program was obviously, instrumental in shaping what happened and what's possible in the future. Was patient care for seniors in state settings that led to an 82.6% positive impact for patients and a significant reduction in opioid use. And that really served as the proof of concept for Trump's federal action. Kessler's program demonstrated that when a vulnerable population like seniors who, like many others, maybe veterans with PTSD who are, can't wait another day to get off opiates, or so many other vulnerable populations. When they were administered medical cannabis by physicians, there was a positive impact, including reductions in the use of high-risk pharmaceuticals like opiates. So this initiative really serves as the first government-led state coordinated testing of quality and outcomes for cannabinoid therapy. What CMS will do now is collect data on these patient outcomes, analyze it, and make that data public to inform future standards of care. And I think that can also inform regulatory frameworks. As many know, state programs have long struggled to generate clinical data due to absurd federal research barriers. And this pilot program can really bridge that gap by collecting large scale data and supporting the qualifying conditions with evidence-based research that we have in many states. And if you look at the map of states with medical and adult use laws, there's obviously almost all the states have a medical cannabis program. Patients are being treated in real time. The fact that we haven't been able to use that research and the outcomes of that treatment to inform, evidence-based medicine and to inform the appropriate, scheduling and future regulation of cannabis has been a huge obstacle, for the industry and for medicine. So, I think the significance of this is really what states have proved over the last decade, that there's real world evidence that we can use to support medical cannabis, and that we can document and pursue this research at state and federal levels. So I think this, the CMS published the original pilot program authorization on November 28th in the Federal Register, which, historically authorized coverage for senior care, Medicaid reimbursed cannabis medicine for seniors. The rules that currently govern these pilot programs require federally legal cannabis, meaning coming from legal hemp or a DEA registered marijuana source, and being limited to FDA approved drugs, which, as Charlie went through, are a very limited universe of pharmaceutical drugs. What we can expect in the next few months is to see what this pilot program will look like based on the president's directive, and what will that mean with respect to the legal source. The president was very clear that he intends to fix the new restrictive definition of hemp. That, of course, impacts the viability of using hemp as a legal source in this pilot program. For the pilot program to be practically efficacious, with especially for vulnerable populations who need this treatment immediately, we can't be limited to FDA approved drugs. So the industry really has an opportunity, to use this proof of concept to build future state research partnerships. And this specific program is slated to become active as early as April. And there's currently a comment period underway for the current CMS rules. And then, we've really set the table for coordinated state engagement here and formalizing data sharing between state regulators and federal agencies, and supporting a unified data system. And I think this can also have significant impacts for psychedelics and natural medicine, which are embarking on the same pathway with state regulated medical programs where we're getting patient outcome data, that's important to inform, federal regulation and evidence-based medicine. So, it's important to, I think, watch and stay engaged in this process and engage on state and federal levels. And, we'll see in the coming months, what the full components of the pilot program look like. And, I would just say also that the executive order and the CMS pilot really reinforce that, there's likely going to be a distinct lane for the medical cannabis framework. And, that framework aligns with federal reimbursement pathways. and, giving full federal legality for patients and doctors and researchers. And then also sets the table for an adult use lane for cannabinoids, and, kind of bifurcating the market between medical and adult use. So I'll turn it over to Cassia to talk more about what this means for hemp and, where it potentially can go for unity of the whole plant. But I think establishing these clear lanes provides a real clear and stable pathway for businesses to integrate into the broader healthcare system if they want to, without the constant threat of shifting federal definitions and, murky federal legality. And then hemp operators and adult use businesses can also have a pathway here, that now we have the administration's engagement to help shape. So I'll turn it over to Cassia to dive deeper on the hemp piece.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm just going to pick up a couple of those threads and kind of bring us home here. There's a lot to consider and a lot of work left to be done. Obviously the primary focus of the executive order is marijuana rescheduling from 1 to 3, but its treatment of hemp-derived cannabinoid products is highly consequential in this environment, particularly following the early November congressional action, which would effectively ban, most hemp products on the market today in around mid-November of 2026, in the absence of subsequent reform from Congress. And, with the focus of the executive order on medical research and medical patients, which frankly we love to see, that's where this industry started, that's its heart, and love to see it coming back around to that focus with this action. The executive order acknowledges that current laws create a confusing patchwork for consumers, doctors, and producers. And that framework just got more complicated in the beginning of November with Congress's action, which I think came as somewhat of a surprise to the executive and a lot of groups that have been advocating for these issues and sort of advancement from multiple directives for many years. And it acknowledges, if you watched the sort of signing ceremony around the EO and the subsequent dialogue, they talk quite a bit about hemp. And part of the reason for that, or big reason, is that they've been sourcing, hemp for these programs, for the pilot program, because it's federally legal currently. And I think that this goes a long way. Section 2B of the executive order explicitly directing Congress and the agencies to update the statutory definition of hemp, that we acknowledging that patients and medical researchers have been accessing these products and materials outside of the licensed cannabis market for necessary legal reasons, since sort of the rise of hemp as a exception under the Farm Bill. And I think that one of the positives of this rescheduling effort is to reframe hemp and cannabis as one plant, as it's always been, and to acknowledge these separate lanes for uses and products, which is something that everybody involved in the industry has long advocated for, and businesses and advocates from various lanes have sort of come together in different ways to push forward. Specifically, the executive order talks about directing Congress to carve out protections for full spectrum CBD, ensuring therapeutic access, while at the same time restricting intoxicating hemp products that pose health risks, and were the reason that Congress banned and sort of ended the loophole to begin with. So we expect this review to include review of the current 0.4 milligram per container limit and the work in progress restrictions that threaten to reclassify many full spectrum CBD products, such as the kind that are being advocated for in these pilot programs and widely used by seniors, veterans, and other groups across the country, as controlled substances, which no one wants, frankly. Calls for the development of a regulatory framework that would establish THC limits per serving and per container, along with a review of CBD to THC ratio requirements. and further acknowledges, I think implicitly, the reality that high efficacy CBD products typically have THC in them, and that it hasn't necessarily been medically efficacious or effective to remove THC and try to treat a single cannabinoid as a medicine. And so I think we're actually seeing, dare I say, some sort of common sense enter the picture a little bit, and there's a lot to be done with each of the lanes that Sean outlined: the therapeutic lane for full spectrum CBD products, protected for medical and wellness use, potentially easier to reimburse under the new CMS models that the administration is pushing for than cannabis obtained through a dispensary, and more widely available from the adult use lane, which is also benefited by the Schedule 3 announcement. If it, if and when it's implemented, of course. So with these changes, we see a refocus on a whole plant perspective, at least from our view, which is a positive for industry and everybody in it. There's still a lot of work to be done. Some folks pointed out, I've talked to a lot of people in the last couple of weeks since the hemp announcement came out, and then with rescheduling on the horizon, and there's so much effort that needs to be addressed with respect to people who remain in prison for cannabis offenses, with respect to equity and folks coming to the table. But it's very interesting to see the medical community obtain some significant gains here. Hemp having to sort of be reconfigured back into cannabis, I think ultimately for the benefit of consumers, public safety, and industry advocates as a whole, and adult use to receive benefits and have some focus for pushing forward with federal legalization and sort of a incremental approach in that sense. So with that, I think we're going to end things today, but I'm sure we've probably raised as many questions as we've answered in this talk, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we want to, I think this is a call to action for everybody in the cannabis industry as a whole, inclusive of medical, hemp, adult use, whatever your lane is, to work within your sphere of influence to capitalize on this unique moment of attention at the federal level on this issue, to see how far we can get in 2026 and beyond. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and thanks to my colleagues and friends for participating, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.